History of a Teacher by Famous Fault. Chapter 13. The Hogshead. Naturally, Professor McGonagall confronted him before dinner. Professor Flitwick was nowhere to be seen, which meant most likely that Professor Flitwick would leave it to Professor Snape to confront him. Yugi wasn't sure he liked that.
I just taught a class in which nearly every Gryffindor was in shock after coming from your class. Could you inform me on what you did to them?
She asked, her tone very unfriendly.
I taught them history, Yugi said calmly. There was nothing more to it but the truth.
What in Merlin's name did you teach them?
She said, gradually becoming more angry. Yugi wasn't affected by her anger at all, but just kept looking her straight in the eyes. He looked calm to a level that annoyed Minerva McGonagall to her wit's end. I just taught them something that happened not all too long ago. Something that must be prevented from ever happening again. People often don't like to have that knowledge, and some react worse than others. It was necessary, though.
Lavender Brown is in the hospital wing. Ron Weasley was shocked to the verge of insanity. Luckily, Hermione Granger could calm him down, although she wasn't doing all too good herself. Seamus Finnegan looked as if he could have killed someone, and Longbottom was...
McGonagall had to look for the right word.
Empty, there was no other word for it. So was Potter. The only one a little gathered was Dean Thomas.
She yelled angrily, catching the attention of the other teachers. They frowned as they saw the stern-faced teacher unleash her fury on the short Japanese. Yugi frowned. That's very exaggerated. Certainly, people take it bad, but they seldom get into shock. Are you sure they didn't fake it?
They didn't, Yugi,
Atem said, with a tone that worried Yugi far more than McGonagall's anger. He sounded ashamed, and the blood drained from Yugi's face.
Sorry, Yugi. I couldn't help it.
What did you do? Yugi asked. A bad feeling was getting a grip on his stomach. Here, he told McGonagall without even looking at her. Read this. He pushed a book in her hands. If you want to know more, 1945, that should explain it. Without even reacting to the teacher's protests, he turned around and walked into the Great Hall, not entirely conscious of what he had just said and given to Professor McGonagall. Atem explained.
I lost control over the shadows. Once I realized where you were heading with your lesson, I let the shadows flicker out towards the students, but instead of simply increasing their disgust and terror like I was aiming for, it started to show them what you told. Not only them, but me too. That's why I wasn't able to pull them back.
What exactly did they see? Yugi wondered, his own terror growing stronger each moment.
It differed depending on the student, or, well, actually, they all saw the same things, but from different points of view in very different situations. Parvati Patil saw the experiments of Joseph Mengele, though I think it was slightly worse than seeing. I think she could hear and smell and feel everything, too. I'm sure she actually experienced one of these tests together with her sister. She saw everything else too, life in a concentration camp and the gas chambers and such, yet I don't believe it affected her equally much. Malfoy saw Anne Frank work and die. In his experience, he was working next to her under the same conditions. He could feel her sorrow and pain, since he felt the same thing himself. He also saw a lot of different things just as bad. Ron Weasley actually experienced preparing and burning Hermione Granger as if it was a real-life experience, while Hermione Granger probably lived the gassing itself. I don't know what everyone saw, but they all saw it. Me too, I experienced watching without being able to do anything. It was a terrible feeling. I was standing right next to Anne, too, and I also saw Mengele's experiments. Yet those things just can't live up to how I felt when I saw all these people die without being able to stop it.
You're in shock, Yugi realized, and vaguely noticed that he was nearly so himself.
They don't consciously know that they lived it, but they are equally affected by what you told as if they actually had spent a couple of years in a concentration or extermination camps. I can't believe I did this to them. I exposed them to life in these camps. I feel so guilty. I was just afraid that some of them would sympathize with the SS and the Gestapo.
Please, Atem, calm down, Yugi begged, feeling tears gathering in his eyes. He stood up, trying not to call upon too much attention as he left the Great Hall. He hurried through the hallways, and when he ran into Beeves, the ghost hurried off quickly. He was afraid of the ancient spirit in the puzzle and did what he could to prevent running into him. When Yugi reached his room, he just lied down on his bed, breathing heavily. He didn't know what to do about the obviously shocked spirit and was glad that he hadn't been affected by the shadows. He'd ask Atem why as soon as he'd gathered himself. Yugi was in Hogsmeade way before the first teachers and students arrived that weekend. It was a bright day but windy, so he didn't stick out with his hood on. Most people were taking cover from the wind by using their hoods. Yugi kept his face hidden carefully. He knew he was the kind of person that people tended to remember, and he really didn't want to be noticed by anyone. It would severely ruin the shaky reputation he already had. He would have liked to look around in the village more thoroughly, but he didn't dare enter a shop. The day before, he had informed Rebecca about the meeting and told Madame Hooch that he'd be staying at Hogwarts since he felt the beginning of a cold he'd rather avoid. Would he be seen sneaking around Hogsmeade after telling everyone he was ill wouldn't be very great. He found the Hogshead faster than he'd expected. The pub was dirty and smelled terribly. The stone floor seemed to be made out of earth due to the filth that was gathered there. Yugi didn't notice the windows directly, since they were covered with grime to the extent that it kept sunlight from entering the small room. Stubs of candles lit the place, and when Yugi opened the door, the wind extinguished half of them at once. Every person in the bar looked up at the small posture in the door opening, but decided he was neither a threat nor any of their business, and returned to whatever they were doing. He didn't order anything to drink, but sat down in a corner booth and put his boots on the table. He didn't bother putting fire on his candle, but allowed himself to be shrouded in the darkness. That way it would be easier to observe the room. Two men with heavy accents that Yugi couldn't place were talking to each other, both wearing hoods, like Yugi himself. A man looking much like a mummy was sitting at the bar, his head covered with bandages, turning gray with dirt and age. Soon after Yugi arrived, a witch with a black veil entered the room and sat down close to the fireplace. Yugi wished he had come later. Here he had nothing to do but think. The pharaoh was still in shock from his experience in the camps, and though Yugi tried to convince him it wasn't real, it didn't help. The two of them knew it had been very real to very many people, and words couldn't change the experience Atem had gotten. In little over an hour, Atem experienced nearly 5 years of torture, death, famine, illness, and even inhumane experiments. That he could only barely remember it consciously didn't change a thing. The effects were the same as for the people who had lived it 50 years ago. Atem's entire being had been thoroughly shaken. Yugi was afraid of what would happen to his best friend. He had heard enough stories about people who never recovered from what had happened. Atem had assured Yugi that he'd be fine, and Yugi knew that the ancient spirit was most likely right. If Atem couldn't deal, no one could, and that was the exact thought that haunted the pharaoh. He was worried sick about the students he had put through the same thing. It was guilt which ruled his mind. Guilt and shame. Yugi was rather uncertain on where things would be heading from now on. The students hadn't been equally conscious of what had happened to them as Atem, but Parvati Patil, Tracy Davis, and Lavender Brown hadn't attended any more classes that day. They had been far too shocked for it. They were simply completely traumatized. Every single teacher had now turned to avoiding Yugi, the only exception being Madame Hooch, although even she had grown more distant. They glared and whispered, but Yugi didn't care. He had problems enough without worrying about the teachers. Dumbledore hadn't confronted him either. Yugi wondered about him. What was the headmaster playing at? Did he approve of the method Atem had used by mistake? It was that moment that Ron, Harry, and Hermione entered the pub. "I don't know about this, Hermione," Harry whispered and looked around at each individual in the pub. "Has it occurred to you that Umbridge could be under that?" He was looking at the veiled witch. Yugi was glad that Harry hadn't looked at him more closely. Hermione didn't seem to worry, though. "Umbridge is shorter than that woman. And anyway, even if Umbridge does come in here, there's nothing she could do to stop us, Harry, because I've double and triple checked the school rules. We're not out of bounds. I specifically asked Professor Flitwick whether students were allowed to come in the Hogshead, and he said yes, but he advised me strongly to bring our own glasses." Yugi sniggered silently. He was suddenly very glad that he hadn't ordered anything. The 3 students ordered a butterbeer each, and Ron wondered seemingly casually, "You know what? We could order anything we liked in here. I bet that bloke would sell us anything. He wouldn't care. I've always wanted to try fire whiskey." He had a happy smile on his face at the thought. However, that smile faded quickly as Hermione snarled, "You are a prefect!" "They act pretty normal," Atem said, and suddenly sat next to Yugi, invisible to everyone else. "They do," Yugi replied carefully. He really didn't know what to say. "It's as if it didn't happen at all. But they must feel it, mustn't they?" Atem wondered. "I mean, I know how it feels, and we saw their reactions." "Perhaps they are strong, Atem. Strong enough to learn from it rather than to break down underneath its weight." And they don't know that they could just as well have spent several years in a camp and act the way they are acting currently.
Let's hope so.
Atem sighed and focused his gaze on the door as it opened and a stream of students entered. First came Neville with Dean, and Yugi surprised Lavender. He hadn't expected her to come since she clearly had been heavily affected by what the shadows had showed her. They were followed by Parvati and Padma Patil, and this time Yugi could see the clear effect that the shadows had left. Parvati was looking around like a deer in despair, clutching her sister's hand as if it was the only thing that kept her alive. Her sister seemed to be confused, but had an arm around Parvati's waist in means of comfort, and so they walked in. Cho Chang followed together with a girl named Marietta. Yugi had taught the 5th year Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs the very same class the previous day, and the reactions there had been more confusion and anger than the zombie-like state the Gryffindors and Slytherins had gotten into. Marietta hadn't seemed to care the least, and so did several others of the Ravenclaw girls. Yugi doubted that they had realized that people actually had suffered what he told them. Luna Lovegood came in after that on her own, and for a moment Yugi thought she'd taken a wrong turn. Many more students came, far more than Yugi had expected. Katie Bell, Alicia Spinett, Angelina Johnson, Colin and Dennis Creevy, Ernie McMillan, Justin Finch Fletchley, Hannah Abbott, and then Rebecca came in together with a boy in her class that Yugi knew was Peter Lippard. More people entered, and Yugi could see how Harry slowly turned pale. Eventually, the stream ended with Fred and George Weasley together with Lee Jordan. "A couple people?" Harry said hoarsely. "A couple of people?" Yugi didn't follow the little exchange between Hermione and Harry. He was looking for Tracy Davis. It'd be understandable if she didn't show, yet he had hoped she would. Fred ordered the total amount of 25 butterbeers. The barman didn't seem very pleased, but he put 25 butterbeers on the counter as Fred asked for some money from all the students so he'd be able to pay. The students sat down and Yugi had his focus with them, though he kept throwing glances at the door. Soon the chatter died out and everyone was looking at Harry. Yugi pitied the green-eyed boy. It couldn't be easy for him to have so much attention upon him after the traumatizing events Yugi had put him through.
"That wasn't you. That was me,"
Atem remarked dryly. Yugi didn't comment, but threw the door another look before turning his attention to the group of students. Hermione said. Hi. Well, you all know why you were here. Harry here had the idea. Harry glared at her, making Yugi smile involuntarily. I mean, I had the idea that it might be good if people who wanted to study defense against the dark arts, and I mean really study it, not the rubbish Umbridge is doing, because no one... The door opened, and Yugi looked up simultaneously as every student in the room. In the doorway stood Tracy Davis. It was obviously that she had tried to sneak in silently without calling upon too much attention, but the door made way too much noise, and every eye in the bar was upon her. Whispers erupted among the students. Many stood up directly and drew their wands. Yugi frowned but didn't interfere. Rebecca, who knew about Tracy, gripped Peter's arm and pulled him back on his chair. "Put that thing away," she snapped. "But..." "No!" she snarled, and Peter obeyed. Yugi laughed silently. He was very grateful for Rebecca's help. He realized that his strength would always lay in his friends. Luna Lovegood did much the same on Marietta and Cho, who snarled at her in protest and called her loony in response. They received a light blow each from Rebecca, who gave Luna a friendly smile. Yugi noticed that not one of the students that had been in his class the previous Thursday had a strong reaction. They just looked at Tracy with a frown on their face. Padma Patil was also pulled down, she by her twin sister. "It's okay, Tracy was with us. She fought too." These words made everyone look at Parvati, but when every 5th year Gryffindor nodded, the rest simply settled for being very confused. What did Parvati mean by that, Atem? Yugi wondered.
"I suppose that their time in the camps together showed everyone's true nature. Parvati seems to be very aware of what happened deep in her unconscious mind. That's not good, neither for her nor for us."
You mean that Tracy proved to be trustworthy in what happened to them in the camps? Yugi wondered, confused. He found it hard to put what had happened into words. They hadn't really been in camps, but as good as. The fact that they couldn't remember it made everything more complicated, especially since they had all the problems a survivor would have had. I thought they experienced the things individually, Yugi said.
"No, we were in it together. As Draco Malfoy and Ron Weasley were being shoved off the train and selected, As a Sonderkommando, Neville was being taken away by SS soldiers since he was trying to warn everyone else about what was to come and shot, while Hermione was brought into the gas chambers. With Hermione walked Dean, who held the hands of two little children that were crying for their mother. Lavender had died during the travel in the train, and Parvati didn't want to get off, since she wouldn't leave Lavender. This happened when you were reading the notes of the Swedish diplomat, and after. We were always close to each other, yet doing different things. It was, well, like the real thing. Same when you set the example, and when you mentioned Anne Frank and Joseph Mengele.
Yugi's hands had started shaking.
Did any join the SS? He wondered, entirely horrified by what Atem had just told him.
Yes, in the beginning, but that soon changed. Gregory Goyle, Theodore Knott, and Vincent Crabbe were with the SS in the beginning. But soon they were prisoners too. What they saw changed their sympathy to disgust. Drago became a prisoner sooner, though. He turned into a prisoner as soon as he saw the misery that he couldn't have imagined. He lost his sympathy in little less than a minute after the vision started. Gregory and Vincent did as they saw people crying over their dead beloved ones.
Atem said, ignorant over how horrified Yugi was.
Did Lavender know that she was dying?
Yugi said, praying that the answer was no.
Yugi, it was real. Lavender could feel the desperate need for water and food. She could feel the burning in her throat and stomach. She could feel the pain when people stepped on her. She could feel the fear of dying. I'm sure that nearly each and every student experienced how it is to die.
Yugi couldn't answer. He was slightly sick.
Tracy comforted children too. She shared the food that she managed to get with those in more need of it. She took care of the ill ones when possible, and stood up to the SS openly, together with Dean when they abused an 8-year-old. Parvati was there when it happened, and so was the rest of the class. She and Dean both got shot, but clearly Parvati remembers it, and deep down so do the rest.
Yugi felt tears making a path down his cheeks, and suddenly understood why Atem felt so incredibly guilty. Tracy raised her hands to show that she meant no harm and was defenseless.
The reason I'm here is the same as the rest of you. I also want to learn how to fight.
She said it in a whisper. Yugi could barely hear her. You're right, Lee Jordan said. You think we'd fall for that?
Yugi, aren't you going to interfere?
Atem wondered. Yugi shook his head lightly. No, with my reputation, I'd make things worse than they already are.
I wasn't bluffing. I'm serious,
she said, hurt, though she held her head high. Clearly she had prepared herself for this. A Ravenclaw named Terry Boot walked towards Tracy and bypassed her. He opened the door behind her and looked outside. He lifted his wand and shouted, Hominum Revelio! At the area outside Hogshead. She's alone, he stated, and walked back towards the rest of the group. Foolish Slytherin coming alone, Marietta shouted, receiving an additional and much harder blow on the back of her head from Rebecca. You're Tracy Davis, right? She wondered and gave the girl a wink to make sure that the Slytherin knew that Yugi hadn't left her to her fate and that she had an ally in the group opposite her.
Yeah, I am,
Tracy said and blushed. Hi, Trace, Dean said cheerfully and stood up. How come you knew that we gathered here? He walked towards her and draped casually an arm around the girl, who immediately turned red.
I heard Hawkins tell Leopard, though. I thought it sounded like a good idea. I know it's weird that a Slytherin shows up, but I thought I should anyway. You know, to prove that not all Slytherins carry the same values. That some of us would side with Hogwarts when war breaks loose, she said. She seemed to have trouble finding her words, but finally decided that she better didn't try to talk to a group and focus on one individual. Her gaze caught Harry's, and she held it. I believe you, Harry. I believe that he who must... Oh, screw it. I believe that Voldemort is back, and I want to fight him.
Each and every living being, and a dead one too, in the Hogshead were staring at Tracy. They were simply too surprised to react to the name they all feared so much. Wow, Ron said, and was the one to break the tension. You really know how to use your words. The comment was met with spread laughter from the group of students. Would you be denied the right to join us in opposing Umbridge and the Ministry by learning how to fight and defend ourselves against Voldemort because of the house you belong to? I didn't think so. The Sorting Hat warned us against that kind of idiocy, so I think you're welcome to join us like everyone else here. Dean certainly doesn't seem to mind. Any objections? Hermione wondered. Dean blushed and threw Hermione a furious gaze. Hermione just smiled at him innocently. When no one did object, Tracy gave a weak smile and Dean beamed at her. Well, Hermione, carry on, he he said with a broad smile, not able to maintain his fury.
Well, I thought we should take matters into our own hands.
Tracy did it very well, Yugi said. I am proud of her. Dean and Terry made it a lot easier, though, and so did the knowledge they already had about Tracy. It's working in her advantage right now. Since we can't change the fact that it happened, let's just hope they take what they have learned from each other in consideration every time something like this happens.
Stop trying to make me feel better.
Atem said grumpy and retrieved it to the very outskirts of his mind. Yugi didn't say anything on that, mostly due to the fact that Atem most likely wouldn't be able to hear him if he did. He turned his attention back to the students. What makes me say that you know who's back? Harry wondered, his eyes firmly on a blonde Hufflepuff boy that Yugi knew to be Zacharias Smith. Harry didn't look very happy, and Yugi was sure that he'd lose his temper. I saw him. But Dumbledore told the whole school what happened last year, and if you didn't believe him, you don't believe me. And I'm not wasting an afternoon trying to convince anyone. Tracy bravely opened her mouth to say something, but Zacharias beat her to the point. He wasn't done yet, and seemed to be oblivious to Harry's rising temper. All Dumbledore told us last year was that Cedric Diggory was killed by you-know-who, and that you brought his body back to Hogwarts. He didn't give us details. He didn't tell us exactly how Diggory got murdered. I think we'd all like to know. If you've come here to hear exactly what it looks like when Voldemort murders someone, I can't help you. I don't want to talk about Cedric Diggory, alright? So if that's what you were here for, you might as well clear out. He threw Hermione an angry gaze, and Yugi felt sorry for her. She seemed to be under more fire than she deserved. When everyone stayed, but Hermione spoke up again.
So, she said, like I was saying, if you want to learn some defense, then we need to work out how we're going to do it, how often we are going to meet, and how we're going to... Is it true that you could produce a Patronus?
A Hufflepuff girl with a long plait called Susan Bones wondered. This interested the group immensely. Murmurs of interest went through it. Yeah, Harry said with a frown.
A corporeal Patronus?
She wondered. Yugi had long since lost track of the conversation. He had no idea who Cedric Diggory was, but from what he had gathered, he understood that Harry hadn't had an easy term the previous year. Neither did Yugi know what a Patronus was, but personally he found Cedric Diggory more interesting. Harry said, you don't know Madame Bones, do you? He wondered.
The girl smiled. She's my auntie, she said. I'm Susan Bones. She told me about your hearing. So, is it really true you make a stag Patronus?
Atem! Yugi called out, slightly annoyed. What's a hearing? Atem explained quickly, and Yugi shook his head. Doesn't he ever stay out of trouble? Yes, Harry said, answering the Hufflepuff girl. Blimey, Harry, Lee said, looking impressed and making Yugi laugh silently at the word. I never knew that. Mom told us not to spread it around, one of the Weasley twins said, grinning. Yugi couldn't keep them apart. She said you got enough attention as it was. She's not wrong, the dark-haired boy mumbled. From that point on, the conversation shifted to Harry's advantage. At a certain point, he decided to put an end to it. Look, he said, and everyone fell silent. I don't want to sound like I'm trying to be modest or anything, but I had a lot of help with all that stuff. Not with the dragon, that was a seriously cool bit of flying. Yeah, well, and no one helps you get rid of those Dementors this summer. Protests came from various directions, but Harry opposed them quickly. No, okay, I know I did bits of it without help, but the point I'm trying to make is... Are you trying to weasel out of showing any of this stuff? Zacharias Smith said, slightly scornful. Ron Weasley reacted at once, probably on the word weasel than anything else. Here's an idea, why don't you shut your mouth? Yugi prayed that Ron wouldn't hit the Hufflepuff, although it looked like he wanted to. Well, we've all turned up to learn from him, and now he's telling us he can't really do any of it. Zachariah pressed on, unaffected by Ron's threat. That's not what he's saying, one of the Weasley twins said, affronted. Yugi continued to listen, but not much more of importance was said. They argued a little more about insignificant things and started to brainstorm about when and where. They left after each individual put their name on a list, one that looked very innocent, but Yugi doubted it was. Hermione warned them all once not to shout around what they were doing, and with that, they all left. Well, I think that went quite well, Hermione said as she, Ron, and Harry left the Hogshead. With that, the silence returned to the pub. The bartender shook his head and muttered unfriendly to himself. At least Brett's gonna make a habit of showing up in here every time they get outside that school of them. I'm closing this place.